Hello, and I want to say before I begin, thank you to the Global Alliance for Genomics and Health for allowing me to present to you today my presentation, Reimagining Data. My name is Jasmine McNealy. I'm an associate professor at the University of Florida, where I'm also a part of the, or affiliate with the Department of Computer Science, and as well as centers at the law school and in the College of Engineering. More importantly, I suppose, is that I've been thinking a lot about data governance, surveillance, privacy, and all the things that we think about when we think about data and what data actually means. So this presentation, as I give it to you, is really some of the considerations I have with respect to data and how we talk about it, but how we should talk about it, how we should maintain it, how we should protect it, and perhaps how we should get rid of or prohibit certain uses of it. This is particularly important with respect to genomic and health data, which we call some of the most sensitive, if not the most sensitive data that there is with respect to people, communities, and organizations. So thinking about this then, what is it that we should talk about when we talk about data? So I'm calling this reimagining data because I think we need to really reconsider what it is we talk about when we talk about data. The myths, the imaginaries, the metaphors that we use when we talk about data. Prior to this, I had talked about an ecological approach to data governance, which requires us to really rethink data. So instead of some abstract concept, we should think of data as a network representation, in particular, a network representation of people, of a group of people, perhaps with one person at the center of that metaphor or imaginary, but people are really important to the idea of data. So perhaps let me begin with an important and relevant topic to all of us, and that is our current status, and that is the pandemic, which has totally reshaped how we do things, how we conduct ourselves across the globe. Perhaps more important to that, it has brought up several issues with respect to technology and data that are worthy of consideration with respect to health and genomics. So COVID-19, a pandemic that has shut down the world and laid bare many of our dysfunctions in several parts of the society, has required or is requiring governments to do something, to engage in the form of contact tracing, which in general would mean trying to find out who people have been in contact with, if they've been exposed to the virus or possibly exposed to the virus from their social networks or people that they've been around or come in contact with, whether that's through them actually knowing them or just being in the same vicinity. Governments are recruiting technology firms to assist with them. And of course, we have the very large firms like Apple, like Google, who are major players in this area. And so what you have in recent months is Apple and Google partnering or attempting to partner with several governments in the United States, around the world, to build infrastructure, already using technology that we have. So our cell phones, which are very ubiquitous with respect to many populations, not everybody, but many communities are saturated with cell phones. So it's an easy technology to use as a basis for contact tracing technology. And Apple and Google are being touted as ways to accelerate contact tracing because of the adoption of things like cellular phones, also the use of things like searches and search machines, or search engines, I should say, and people using them as a possible way to trace people with questions about COVID-19 and infection. And, you know, several nations around the world are considering or have considered partnering with these large tech firms. The issue with this is that any infrastructure you create has a lasting impact. And the impacts we know could possibly be very disparate and negative for several communities who are already marginalized or vulnerable. More importantly, perhaps, is how we are considering data in respect to these technologies as separate from the infrastructure itself. So what I mean by infrastructure, and I've said that word several times in the past minute or so, is the basics, physical and organizational structures and facilities. So thinking buildings, roads, power supplies needed for the operation of a society or enterprise. Therefore, I'm claiming that data is an infrastructure. So the very definition I gave earlier, the data is a networked observation or representation, is actually infrastructure for conducting the operation of society or an enterprise. And I'll show you how in a second. So by infrastructure, I mean both the structural, we're thinking of buildings, we're thinking of roads, we're thinking of structures or things that allow us to do things. But the non-structural also matters. And that is ways of framing or ways of going about things or ways that allow us to do things that we need to do or we think we need to do or perceived as necessary for us to function as a society. And then thirdly, we're going to talk about people and how people act as infrastructure and how that matters to our definition of infrastructure, but also data and how we should reimagine data. So I think that COVID-19 example I just gave you is really important, but perhaps more relevant to what we've been talking about as far as genomics and health data is the example of GED match. Now I use this example a lot because I think it's really interesting, but also relevant for those of us who are interested in things like DNA and DNA testing, what DNA can tell us about ourselves and our families and about different communities and people. So GED match, one of the many now testing sites related to ancestry and connections available on the web. There are several other direct-to-consumer firms that you probably heard about already. But GED match is one of those. Late last year, in connection with the site and what it's able to do, GED match was used by law enforcement and has been used by law enforcement to investigate crimes. Some old crimes, as is the case with this example here, calling GED match the genealogy site that helped catch the Golden State Killer, but also other things. Maybe we'll consider them lesser crimes or not well-known crimes as well. And the law enforcement are using these sites and the information they contain to do research, to conduct investigations. But what you see is that these sites are then infrastructure. So important to this story is the fact that a person submitted their DNA to be tested, and the purposes for which they submitted their DNA to the site were beyond the scope of what perhaps law enforcement wanted to use it for. Most people submit their information to sites like Ancestry.com or GED Match to find relatives, to find perhaps where they're from, maybe to find out about medical conditions and the possibility of genetic conditions. But most do not subscribe to allowing law enforcement to use their information, although some do. But more importantly is that the person that was implicated in the crime did not sign up for their DNA to be used. So when we talk about DNA and we talk about data being a network representation, I think this is an important example. While it is infrastructure, that infrastructure leads to other people who are not participating in creating or sustaining research or law enforcement activities or other activities without their permission. And so this is something to consider with respect to genomics and genomic databases and databases like GEDmatch. So what about infrastructure without structure? When I'm talking about infrastructure without structure, I'm considering law, policy, regulations, and guidelines. Now, many of these come with the other kinds of infrastructure, the laws, the roads, I should say, the buildings, right? So there are laws related to roads and how we use those roads. There are policies related to buildings and occupation of buildings and how buildings are used and certain kinds of architectural structures. Guidelines related to internet use and claims that can be made by purveyors of certain kinds of media, social media, for example. So this is what I mean by infrastructure without structure. There are no actual buildings, there are no actual tools, but there are frames, there are structures that we have to follow. So there are law, there is policy, there are regulation that act as infrastructure in connection to data. I also want to talk about people as infrastructure. So I've talked about data and how data could relate to infrastructure and how data is a network representation or observation. What I really am pointing to is how people are data, or how data is people, particularly in the health and genomic data sense. And what does that mean for infrastructure then, or how we consider infrastructure? So if I say that people is data, or that data should be considered people, is what I mean when we say that data is a networked observation or representation. It represents the human. Obviously, physically, people can't be in databases or data banks or trusts or co-ops or whatever we want to call them, but their representation, their network representation or observation can be there. But when we say that people are data, it comes with requirements. So if data is infrastructure, people are infrastructure. And for this, I use Simone's 2004 piece related to people as infrastructure, actually called People as Infrastructure, Intersecting Fragments in Johannesburg. So he says that people as infrastructure, modes of provisioning and articulation viewed as making the city productive, reproducing it and positioning its residents, territories, and resources in specific ensembles where the energies of individuals can be most efficiently deployed and accounted for. So we use that in a data sense. We're not talking about us making a city productive, but we're talking about making every technology that uses data, research that uses data, investigations that use data, more efficient, more effective, right? So we're able to make inferences. We're able to answer questions. Why? Because data is allowing it, but people, data as people are allowing it. So in this way, data are infrastructure. But if we use people as infrastructure, if we use data as infrastructure, that comes with responsibility. And that means that we have to act in certain ways to ensure protection, maintenance, sustainability, and protecting people are the paramount things with respect to data as infrastructure. So this requires us to recognize the implications for different communities and different people. That means funding things like protection And also it requires that non-structural infrastructure. It requires legislation and policy to ensure that people, data as infrastructure are protected from the possible negative harms related to the uses and abuses of data that we are seeing currently. So in thinking about this, I would think that we need to reimagine how we think about data. And that means rethinking what data is, repositioning it as personal, as related more to the individual, and thinking about all the other individuals it possibly touches when we think about people as data and data as infrastructure. Thank you.